The wind was the first thing you knew about this land, and the last thing you'd forget. It was a constant, restless spirit, born somewhere on the endless plains to the west and dying a slow death against the indifferent mountains to the east. It never stopped moving, never stopped whispering its dry, ancient secrets. In the summer, it was a blacksmith's bellows, blasting heat across the territory. In the winter, it was a blade of ice, seeking out the thinnest crack in a man's resolve. Today, it was just weary. It stirred the dust in lazy eddies, a fine red powder that coated everything, the cracked leather of the saddle left on the porch rail, the gray, splintering wood of the barn, the very leaves of the struggling cottonwood tree that was the only green thing for miles. The dust settled in the lines on a man's face and in the quiet corners of his soul. Samuel's ranch was a testament to endurance, not prosperity. The earth itself was a cracked and broken thing, a mosaic of fissures that snaked across fields where corn fought a losing battle against the sun. The fences sagged, their posts bleached to the color of bone. The cattle were lean, all ribs and sharp angles, their hides stretched tight over frames that had learned not to expect abundance. They moved slowly, conserving energy, their dark eyes reflecting the vast, empty sky. Life here didn't flourish, it clung. It held on with a grim tenacity that was almost a form of prayer. The homestead consisted of a small, sturdy house, a barn whose roof was a patchwork of repairs, and a silence that was heavier than any storm cloud. It was a loneliness so profound it had a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders, seeping into the timbers of the house until the very air inside felt old and still. Inside that house, Samuel moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who has learned that haste is a fool's game in a land that measures time in seasons, not hours. He was a tall man, built not with the heavy muscle of a brawler, but the dense, corded strength of one who works from sunup to sundown. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused and capable. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a landscape in its own right, etched with lines of hardship and a quiet, abiding sorrow. His hair was the color of dried wheat, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to hold the horizon's emptiness within them. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. For years, this silence had been shared. Now, it was his alone, a hollow echo in a house that had once held something else. Not joy, perhaps, but a partnership forged in desperation and duty. He was a man living in the wake of a life, the solitary keeper of a story that the land was slowly swallowing, just as it swallowed everything else. He was a widower. That was the story the town of Redemption, a day's ride away, would tell you. They'd say his wife, Hannah, had passed. A fever. Some whispered. An accident. Others guessed. The truth was more complicated and far more silent. The truth was that Hannah was not gone, but she was not truly there, either. She existed in the space between memory and presence, a living ghost in the house Samuel had built. His mind often drifted back to the day he'd brought her here. It wasn't a memory of love, but of necessity, hers and, in a way he hadn't understood then, his own. Hannah had been the wife of another man, a farmer named Silas, who had died with a suddenness that had rattled the small, God-fearing community of Redemption. One morning he was hale and hearty. By evening, he was cold in his bed, a strange peace on his face that the town doctor couldn't explain and the town gossips wouldn't accept. Suspicion, ugly and immediate, had fallen on Hannah. She was quiet, kept to herself, and had an air of sorrow about her that predated her husband's death. The town, needing a villain for a story they couldn't comprehend, cast her in the role. Whispers followed her like flies. Black Widow. The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. I heard she knew about herbs, the kind that can stop a heart. No proof was ever offered. None was needed. Her guilt was decided in the court of public opinion. Over sewing circles and at the saloon bar, she was shunned. Shopkeepers served her last, their hands hesitating as they took her coin. Children were shushed and pulled away when she walked past. The preacher's sermons began to touch on the sins of women and the cunning of the devil. The final blow came when Silas's brother, a man with a greedy eye on the farm, formally accused her. The sheriff, a man who followed the path of least resistance, told her it would be best if she left, for her own safety, he'd said, a phrase that meant the town's peace was more important than her justice. And so, she was cast out. Samuel had found her a week later, not far from his property line, near the dried-up riverbed. She was huddled against a rock, her dress torn, her face smudged with dirt and tears. She looked like a broken-winged bird, something fragile that the merciless land was about to claim. He had watched her from a distance, astride his horse, a long silhouette against the setting sun. He was a man who understood isolation. His own ranch was a self-imposed exile from a world he didn't much care for. In her, he saw not a murderer, but a reflection of his own solitude. He hadn't said much. He never did. He'd dismounted, offered her his canteen, and then, after a long silence broken only by the wind, he'd spoken the words that had changed both their lives. "You can't stay out here. You'll die." He took her back to his ranch. He gave her the small spare room, a bed, and food that she ate with the desperate hunger of a stray. The town of redemption learned of it? Of course. Tongues wagged with renewed fervor. The scandal of it, the quiet rancher Samuel taking in the accused murderess, for a time, they were a story, a dark piece of frontier folklore. Then, weeks later, he rode into town, bought a simple gold band, and had the justice of the peace, a man who valued a fee over gossip, make it official. He married her. He gave her his name, a shield against the world's scorn. It was not an act of passion, but an act of defiance. He had seen an injustice, a cruelty he could not abide, and he had acted in the only way he knew how, simply, directly, and without explanation. That was years ago. The town's gossip had eventually withered from lack of new fuel, settling into a permanent, low-grade disapproval. And Hannah had settled, too. She had become as much a part of the ranch as the creaking windmill and the dust. She was a presence, not a personality. The trauma of her exile had scoured her clean of laughter and light conversation. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, her footsteps soft on the wooden floors. She cooked, she mended, she tended the small, struggling vegetable garden behind the house. She worked alongside Samuel, her silence a perfect match for his. They were partners in all but the truest sense. They shared a roof, a table, and a life of grueling labor. But they did not share a bed in all their years together. She had never borne him a child. The house remained empty of the sounds of a family. Her past was a wall between them, a sorrow so deep it had become the very foundation of her being. She was a widow twice over, once by death, and once by life. She was Samuel's wife in name, but in her heart, she was still the woman cast out, forever grateful, forever separate. The U-shaped brand on their cattle, the brand of Samuel's family, was on everything they owned, but it never felt like it was on her. She was a guest who had never left, a refugee granted permanent asylum in the quiet country of his solitude. The coldness of the house had begun to settle in Samuel's bones. It was a deep, aching chill that hard work and whiskey could no longer warm. He would sit by the fire at night, watching the flames, and the silence would press in. He would look at Hannah, sitting across from him with her mending, her face illuminated in the flickering light, and see not a wife, but a living monument to a past he could not heal. He had saved her from the wilderness, but he could not save her from herself. And in doing so, he had trapped himself in the same quiet prison. The idea came to him slowly, like the dawn on a winter morning. It was a desperate, unconventional thought, born of loneliness and the stark realization that the years were slipping away. as unmarked and barren as the fields outside his window. He needed to bring light into this house. He needed a voice that wasn't the wind's mournful cry. He needed a future, a possibility, something to break the spell of the past. He needed another wife. The notion was scandalous, even for the frontier, but his ranch was its own world, governed by its own laws of survival and sorrow. He spoke to Hannah about it one evening. He laid out the logic, his words spare and practical. The house was too quiet. The work was too much. A child would be a blessing. He spoke of it as if he were planning to buy a new bull or dig a new well. Hannah had listened, her hands still in her lap, her gaze fixed on the fire. He couldn't read her expression. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the logs. Finally, she nodded, a single, slow inclination of her head. She did not look at him. She just said, her voice barely a whisper, "If that is what you need." There was no anger, no jealousy, only a profound, bottomless resignation, the acceptance of a woman who believed she had no right to ask for anything. And so, Samuel wrote a letter. He sent it east, to an agency in New York that promised to connect respectable, hard-working men of the West with proper, church-going women seeking a husband and a new life. His letter was like him, direct, honest, and unadorned. He described his ranch, the hardship, the isolation. He wrote of his need for a wife, a partner to help build a life, and, God willing, a family. He enclosed a photograph of himself, standing stiffly in front of his house, his face grim, the vast, empty land stretching out behind him. He did not mention Hannah. He described himself, simply, as a man alone. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The heat of summer baked the land until it was as hard as pottery. And then the first cool winds of autumn began their yearly lament. Samuel had almost forgotten the letter, dismissing it as a fool's hope, when a reply finally arrived. It was from a woman named Clara. Her handwriting was delicate, a series of elegant loops and fine lines that seemed entirely out of place in his rough, calloused hands. She was from New York City, a place he could barely imagine, a world of crowds and brick buildings and noise. She wrote that she was tired of the city, that she sought a simpler, more honest life. She was a seamstress, she wrote, of good character and health. Her words were proper, almost poetic, but between the lines. Samuel sensed a desperation that echoed his own. There was a hint of a shadow in her letter, a vague mention of a past I wish to leave behind, and a desire for a new beginning where I am not known. They exchanged 2 more letters. His were short and practical. Hers were longer, filled with questions about the land, the work, the life she was considering. She sounded fragile, like a city bird unsuited for the harsh plains, but there was a current of steel beneath the delicate prose. In her last letter, she included a small, formal photograph, a young woman, perhaps 21 or 22, with dark hair pulled back neatly from a pale, serious face. She was not beautiful in the way of saloon girls, all paint and easy smiles. Her beauty was in her eyes. They were dark and deep, and they seemed to hold a profound sadness, a knowledge of the world's disappointments that was far older than her years. She was thin, her dress simple. She looked like someone who had known shame. Samuel looked at the photograph for a long time. He saw a kindred spirit, another soul seeking refuge. He sent the money for her train ticket and stagecoach fare, and he began to wait. The day of Clara's arrival dawned clear and brittle. The sun climbed a pale sky, its light sharp but without warmth. Samuel had ridden into Redemption to meet the stagecoach. He stood on the dusty main street, his horse tethered nearby, feeling the familiar eyes of the townspeople on him. They knew a mail-order bride was coming. News traveled faster than a prairie fire in a town starved for it. He ignored their stares, his gaze fixed on the road east. The stagecoach appeared as a smudge of dust on the horizon before it resolved into a rattling, lurching box pulled by 4 tired horses. It rolled to a stop in a cloud of its own making, the driver shouting and cracking his whip. The doors opened. A few men got out, stretching their legs. And then she appeared. Clara. She stood framed in the doorway for a moment, hesitant, blinking in the harsh light. She was smaller, more delicate than he had imagined. The journey had left its mark. Her face was pale with fatigue, and there was a smudge of dust on her cheek. She wore a dark, sensible traveling dress that was rumpled and gray with grime. She clutched a single, small, scuffed valise to her chest as if it were a shield. It was not the luggage of a woman bringing a life's worth of possessions to a new home. It was the luggage of someone who had fled with only what she could carry. Her eyes scanned the street, searching, and then they found him. He saw a flicker of something in their depths. Fear, perhaps, or just the shock of seeing the man from the stark photograph in the flesh. He was larger, rougher, more imposing than any picture could convey. He saw her swallow, a small, nervous gesture. He stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Miss Clara?" "Mr. Samuel," she replied, her voice softer than he'd expected, a whisper of the East in a land of harsh, flat vowels. He took her valise. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, as if it contained not clothes, but something dense and secret. He helped her down from the stagecoach, his large hand briefly enveloping hers. Her fingers were cold, despite the sun. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Clara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes wide as she took in the vast, unforgiving landscape. She saw the cracked earth, the endless sky, the sheer, crushing scale of the emptiness. He could feel her shrinking, her city-bred spirit recoiling from the raw, brutal beauty of his world. This was not the simpler life of pastoral poems. This was a war against the elements, and the land was winning. As they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, he saw her shoulders slump almost imperceptibly. The stark reality of the sagging barn, the thirsty cattle, the lonely house. It was all there for her to see. A bleak and honest portrait of her new life. There was no hiding its hardship. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The dust settled around them. The only sound was the creak of the windmill, a lonely, rhythmic complaint. Samuel got down and came around to her side, offering his hand to help her down. And as she took it, her gaze lifted to the porch. Hannah was standing there. She stood in the shadow of the doorway, a figure of gray calico and silence. Her hands were clasped at her waist, her face impassive. She was not a memory. She was not a ghost. She was a woman of flesh and blood, standing on the porch of the house where she was mistress, watching another woman arrive to take her place. Clara froze, her foot hovering above the ground. Her eyes darted from the tall, silent man beside her to the still, watchful woman on the porch. Confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep, visceral shock washed over her features. She had been brought to a house that was not empty. She had been purchased to fill a space that was already occupied. Samuel felt the tension arc between the two women, a palpable, silent current. He looked at Hannah, whose eyes held a universe of old sorrows. Then he looked at Clara, whose dark eyes were now filled with a new, raw and terrifying uncertainty. The wind swirled around the three of them, whispering over the parched land, a lonely sound for 3 lonely people standing on the precipice of a life that none of them had chosen, but all of them would now have to live. The first morning was a lesson in the West's peculiar cruelty. Clara woke not to the familiar city sounds of rattling carts and distant bells, but to a silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against her ears. The air in the small attic room was thin and cold. A single square window, set high in the slanted ceiling, framed a rectangle of sky so pale and vast it seemed to erase the world. Dust motes danced in the sliver of sunlight, a silent, swirling galaxy in her small universe. When she descended the narrow, steep stairs, she found the house already alive in its quiet way. Samuel was gone, vanished into the dawn. Hannah was at the cast-iron stove, her back to the room. A pot of coffee bubbled, its bitter aroma the only welcome Clara received. There was no greeting, no good morning. Hannah simply gestured with her head toward a tin plate on the table, which held a piece of dry cornbread and a strip of salted pork. Clara sat, her hands trembling slightly. She tried the water from the pitcher on the table. It was brackish, with a strong, metallic aftertaste that coated her tongue. It was nothing like the clean, cool water of New York. It tasted of the earth, of minerals and struggle. The cornbread was coarse, the pork so salty it made her eyes water. This was the food of survival, not of pleasure. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silent, shared labor. Clara learned that the wind was not merely weather. It was a physical presence, a constant adversary. It whipped her skirts around her legs, stung her cheeks with sand, and found its way through every crack in the house's walls, carrying with it the fine red dust that settled on everything. It was a relentless, scouring force that seemed intent on wearing down not just the land, but the people who dared to live on it. Samuel had not explained Hannah's presence, and Clara was too terrified to ask. The truth settled on her not through words, but through the stark, unspoken reality of their lives. Hannah slept in the main bedroom downstairs, the one that should have been Clara's. She moved about the house with the quiet authority of a wife, her knowledge of its corners and creaks absolute. She was the first wife, the true wife, and Clara was something else, an addition, a purchase, a piece of farm equipment bought through the mail to perform a specific function, to bring new light, as Samuel's letter had so deceptively promised. The shame of it was a physical thing, a hot flush that rose from her chest to her cheeks whenever she caught Hannah looking at her. She was a second wife, a replacement brought in while the original was still in residence, a walking, breathing insult to the woman who had been there first. She had been assigned the attic room, a space clearly meant for storage or perhaps a child who had never come. It was cramped and airless, furnished only with a narrow cot, a small washstand, and a wooden crate for her belongings. Every night, she would climb the stairs to her solitary perch, the sounds of the house below, the scrape of a chair, a soft cough, reminding her of her utter isolation. She would lie on the thin, lumpy mattress, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, a lonely song that matched the ache in her heart. Samuel had made no move to claim her as his wife in the biblical sense. He had not touched her since taking her hand to help her from the wagon. He treated her with a distant, almost formal courtesy that was more chilling than cruelty. She was a guest in her own husband's house, an intruder in her own marriage. Hannah, for her part, was an enigma. She was not unkind, she simply was. She existed in a state of placid observation, her gray eyes following Clara's clumsy attempts to adapt to this new life. There was no hostility in her gaze, but there was no warmth either. It was the detached, assessing look of a farmer watching a new calf learn to stand on wobbly legs. She watched as Clara, whose hands were soft from sewing delicate fabrics, learned to scrub clothes on a washboard with harsh lye soap that reddened her skin. She watched as Clara tried to cook on the temperamental wood stove, burning the biscuits and undercooking the beans. She watched as Clara attempted to help in the garden, her back aching from pulling weeds under the relentless sun. One afternoon, Hannah led Clara to the horse corral. Samuel had a gentle-looking mare, a buckskin named Daisy. Hannah, with a few spare gestures and even fewer words, showed Clara how to saddle the horse. Then, she simply cupped her hands for Clara to mount. Clara, who had only ever ridden in a carriage, was terrified. But the thought of refusing, of showing more weakness in front of this silent, capable woman, was even more terrifying. She scrambled into the saddle, her heart pounding. Hannah adjusted her stirrups and then, without a word, slapped the mare's rump. The horse started forward at a gentle walk, Clara clung to the pommel, her body stiff with fear, but as Daisy ambled around the corral, a strange, exhilarating feeling began to bloom in her chest. For the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of something other than shame and dread. It was a tiny seed of freedom, of mastery over a small piece of this overwhelming world. When she finally slid off the horse, her legs trembling, Hannah was still there, watching. For the first time, Clara thought she saw a flicker of something in the older woman's eyes. It wasn't approval. Not quite. It was a kind of recognition, a shared understanding of the effort required to simply endure. A week after her arrival, the larder was running low, and Samuel announced they would be going into Redemption for supplies. The thought of facing a town, of being seen by strangers, filled Clara with a familiar anxiety. In New York, she had learned to make herself small, to walk with her eyes downcast to avoid notice. She feared the judgment of this new place, a town she imagined to be full of hardy, self-sufficient women who would see her for what she was, a fragile, useless import from the East. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with squat, false-fronted buildings. As Samuel guided the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Faces appeared in windows. Men lounging on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare. Women paused, their market baskets on their arms, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The whispers started almost immediately, a low hum that followed them as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and pickle brine. The storekeeper, a portly man with a slicked-down mustache, greeted Samuel with a gruff nod. His eyes, however, lingered on Clara, slick with a knowing curiosity that made her skin crawl. Samuel gave the man his list and began inspecting some harnesses, leaving Clara to stand awkwardly by the counter. It was then that she heard them. Two women, standing by a barrel of flour, their heads close together, their voices low but carrying in the small space. "That's her," one of them said, a woman with a face like a dried apple. "The new one. Bought her right out of a catalog. They say, 'Lord have mercy,'" the other whispered, fanning her face with her hand, as if one wasn't enough for that strange man. "And living in the same house, too. It's an abomination." "It's that Hannah," the first woman hissed, her voice dropping lower, laced with a venom that was sharp and cold. "She's got some kind of hold on him, always has. It's unnatural. He should have cast her out years ago, after what she did." "Poor Silas," the second woman sighed dramatically. "To be sent to his maker by his own wife's hand, and her getting away with it, too, a black widow, that one, a husband killer. And now Samuel's brought another lamb to the slaughter." The word struck Clara like physical blows. Husband killer. The phrase echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of her mind. She looked over at the women. They saw her watching and quickly turned away, their shoulders stiff with feigned innocence. Clara's blood ran cold. She felt dizzy, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. She looked around the store. The other faces, the men, the storekeeper, they all held the same knowledge in their eyes. This wasn't just gossip. This was a verdict, a story that had been told and retold until it had hardened into fact. Hannah, the quiet, sad woman who mended Samuel's shirts and tended her small garden, the woman who had been cast out by this town, rescued by this silent man. They believed she was a murderer. And Samuel had married her. He had brought her into his home, given her his name, and now he had brought Clara here, too. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dust and dread. Clara sat beside Samuel, the space between them now charged with a new and terrible significance. Every movement he made, the way his large hands held the reins, the set of his jaw, the unreadable depths of his pale eyes, it all seemed menacing. Who was this man she had married? Was he a compassionate soul who had saved an innocent woman from a cruel injustice? Or was he something far darker? A man who knowingly lived with a killer, a man who was himself capable of anything. The fear took root in her heart and began to grow, a thorny, tangled vine. It made her start at every unexpected sound, made her watch Samuel from the corner of her eye, searching his impassive face for any sign of the darkness she now suspected lay beneath. The house, once merely lonely, now felt menacing. Its silence was no longer empty, but full of unspoken secrets and possibilities of violence. Yet a strange and contradictory feeling grew alongside the fear. In the evenings, when Samuel would sit by the fire, the light playing over the strong lines of his face and the breadth of his shoulders, Clara would feel a different kind of tremor run through her. It was a deep, primal loneliness, a yearning to be touched, to be held, to be anchored in this terrifying new world. She was starved for human contact, for a single kind word or a gentle hand, and he, this frightening, enigmatic man, was the only source of it. The fear and the desire became intertwined, a confusing, shameful knot in the pit of her stomach. She feared the secrets he kept, but she craved the strength she saw in his hands. She was terrified of the darkness she imagined in his soul, but she longed for the heat of his body to ward off the cold that had settled deep within her. The storm broke on a Tuesday night. It came on suddenly, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. The wind, which had been a constant murmur, rose to a furious shriek, rattling the window panes and making the whole house groan like a ship in a gale. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof. Lightning split the sky, followed instantly by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Clara lay on her cot in the attic, her body rigid, her hands clenched into fists. Each flash of lightning illuminated her small room in stark, ghostly detail. Each crash of thunder felt like a blow to her heart. The storm outside was a perfect mirror of the turmoil inside her. The fear, the loneliness, the shame, the forbidden desire, it all swirled within her, a tempest of emotion that was becoming unbearable. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't spend one more night alone in this cold high room, suspended between a woman who might be a murderer and a man who might be a monster. Feeling like a ghost, a non-entity, a thing that was observed but never seen. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she swung her legs off the cot. Her bare feet were cold on the rough wooden floor. She didn't bother with a robe. Clad only in her thin cotton nightgown, she crept down the stairs, each step a conscious act of will against the roaring of the storm and the pounding of her own heart. The main room was dark, save for the dying orange glow of the embers in the fireplace. Another flash of lightning lit the room, and she saw him. Samuel was standing by the main window, looking out at the storm. He was just a silhouette, a tall, broad shape against the violent, flashing sky. He must have heard her, because he turned. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He just waited. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was overshadowed by a desperate, reckless need. She stopped a few feet from him. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice so thin it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. He said nothing, his face in shadow. She took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. "I can't be here, in this house, sleeping in that room. I feel like a stranger, like something you watch, but never speak to. I can't stand being looked at like a stranger." Her voice broke on the last word, a sob catching in her throat. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm. Samuel didn't move. Clara stood before him, trembling, vulnerable, her entire future hanging in the balance of his response. She had laid her soul bare, and the silence that followed was terrifying. Then he moved. He took 2 long strides and was in front of her. One of his large, calloused hands came up and gently, almost hesitantly, touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The touch was like a brand, a shock of warmth that went straight through her. The battle in his eyes was visible in the flickering firelight. His own profound loneliness, his duty to the woman he had saved, his raw, unmet needs, it all warred on his face. But the sight of Clara, so fragile and broken before him, tipped the scale. The control he had maintained for so long finally snapped. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss, it was hard and desperate, a kiss of shared solitude and pent-up longing. It tasted of whiskey and rain, and a sorrow so deep it had no words. Clara clung to him, her fear and her desire melting into a single, overwhelming sensation. This was real. This was contact. This was an anchor in the storm. He broke the kiss and scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He was taking her to his room, to his bed. He was finally claiming her. As he turned from the window, another flash of lightning illuminated the entire room. And in that stark, white light, Clara saw her. Hannah. She was standing in the shadows by the hearth, where she had been all along. She hadn't made a sound. She was just there, a silent, motionless observer. Her face a pale, unreadable mask. Her eyes were fixed on them. Two dark pools of... what? Not anger, not jealousy, nothing so simple. It was an ancient, weary acceptance. The gaze of someone who had seen all of life's sorrows and was surprised by nothing. Samuel stopped. He stood frozen in the center of the room, with Clara in his arms. Caught between the two women, between his past and his present. He looked at Hannah, his face a mask of conflict. The air crackled, thick with unspoken history and the tension of the moment. Clara held her breath, certain that Hannah would scream, or cry, or run. But she did none of those things. She simply held Samuel's gaze. The storm raged outside, and the silence inside was a living thing. Then, her lips barely moved, and she spoke, her voice a low, husky whisper that was almost part of the wind itself, a sound of utter resignation, and perhaps of something far more complex. Let her watch. The world outside the window was a churning chaos of water and wind, but inside the small bedroom, a different kind of storm was breaking. Samuel's room was as stark and spare as the man himself. A simple wooden bed frame, a washstand, a single chair. It smelled of him, a scent of dry earth, clean sweat, and something faintly of metal, like a well-used tool. As he carried her across the threshold, Clara felt a tremor of fear and finality. There was no turning back from this. The act itself was a collision, not a tender union. It was fraught with a desperation that was almost violent in its intensity. In Samuel's arms, Clara felt the full, crushing weight of his loneliness, a hunger so profound it had starved for years. She was trembling, caught between the pain of her own inexperience and the raw, overwhelming force of his need. This was not the gentle introduction she had read about in whispered stories or forbidden novels back east. This was a claiming, a branding, a desperate act of possession in the heart of a storm. In the brief, breathless moments of stillness, she became acutely aware of the ghosts in the room. This was not a new or unfamiliar act for him. His hands, though rough, knew the geography of a woman's body. His movements held a memory, a rhythm learned with another. She was not the first to lie in this bed, not the first to be held by these arms. The realization was a shard of ice in her heart. She was a stand-in, a surrogate for a desire that had been born long before she had ever stepped off that stagecoach. But the sheer force of her own yearning, the desperate need to feel something, anything, other than fear and isolation, was a current too strong to fight. For this one night, she let herself be consumed by it, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to water and wind. Outside, the rain had plastered Hannah's thin calico dress to her skin, but she didn't feel the cold. She stood motionless in the mud near the back of the house, her face turned up to the dark, weeping sky. The water ran in rivulets down her face. Mingling with tears she was no longer conscious of shedding. Her eyes, wide and empty, were fixed on the pale, flickering square of light that was the bedroom window. She wasn't watching, not really. She was remembering. The memory that came was of a different night. Years ago, a night without a storm. It was the night Samuel had married her. After the brief, sterile ceremony in town, they had ridden back to the ranch in a silence as vast as the plains around them. He had offered her his room. This same room. She had refused, shaking her head, and had tried to sleep in the small spare room. But he had insisted. It was his duty. She understood. He had given her his name. Now he had to give her his bed. She had cried that entire night. Silent, convulsive sobs into her pillow. She hadn't cried from fear of him. Samuel had never been anything but gentle in his stoic way, but from a wave of shame and unworthiness so profound it threatened to drown her. He had saved her. He had pulled her from the wreckage of her life, shielded her from the scorn of an entire town, and asked for nothing in return. And now, he was owed this. Her body was the final installment on a debt she could never truly repay. When he had finally come to her, his touch was hesitant, almost reluctant. It was the touch of a man performing a duty, not acting on a passion. There was no desire in it, only a grim sense of responsibility, and she had received it as such, a passive offering, a sacrament of gratitude. She had been saved, and salvation, she had learned, was a heavy burden that left no room for frivolous things like love or want. The rain intensified, a cold sheet against her skin, but Hannah didn't move. The light in the window upstairs seemed to burn brighter now. It was different this time. She had heard the desperation in the girl's voice, had seen the hunger in Samuel's eyes. This was not about duty. This was about need. She closed her eyes, letting the storm wash over her. A woman standing vigil at the death of a silence she had curated for years. Clara woke to a cold and silent room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed clean and unnervingly quiet. The space beside her in the bed was empty. Samuel was gone. No note, no lingering warmth, just the impression of his body on the mattress, already fading. A feeling of desolation, sharper and more painful than any she had felt before, swept over her. She had given herself to him, and he had vanished with the dawn, leaving her alone with the consequences. She dressed slowly, her body aching in places she hadn't known existed. When she descended the stairs, the main room was empty. The fire had been stoked, and a pot of coffee was warming on the stove. On the table, at her usual place, sat a single bowl of steaming porridge. A curl of butter was melting in its center. Clara stopped, her hand on the back of a chair. She looked around the quiet room. Through the window, she could see Hannah outside, scattering feed for the chickens, her movements as calm and methodical as they were every other morning. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the storm, the confrontation, the desperate act in the night, had all been a fever dream. Hannah had left the porridge. The gesture was so mundane, so unnervingly normal. It felt like a statement. It was a quiet reassertion of her place, her role. I am still here. I am the one who makes the porridge. Nothing has changed. Clara sat and ate the porridge, each spoonful tasteless in her mouth. She understood then that what existed between Samuel and Hannah was not a marriage of love that she had interrupted. It was something far more complicated. It was a pact, a contract, a debt. Samuel had saved Hannah's life, and Hannah was paying him back with her own, in silent, daily installments of service. And Clara, she was beginning to suspect, was simply another clause in their unspoken agreement, a new tool acquired to fix a part of their broken life that Hannah herself could not. The days that followed confirmed her suspicion. Samuel was even more remote than before. He worked from before sunup to after sundown, his silence now heavier, weighted with something that felt like guilt. He avoided her eyes at the dinner table, and he did not come to her attic room. nor did he invite her back to his. The night of the storm remained an isolated, unacknowledged event, a crack in the smooth facade of their silence that had been quickly plastered over. Driven by a desperate need to understand the foundations of her own strange prison, Clara began to search. One afternoon, while Samuel was out mending a fence line on the far side of the property, and Hannah was down by the riverbed washing clothes, Clara found herself in his bedroom. An old, scuffed wooden chest sat at the foot of the bed. It wasn't locked. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, it smelled of dried lavender and old paper. The contents belonged to Hannah. There was a small, embroidered Bible with a frayed ribbon, a pressed flower that crumbled to dust at her touch, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she shouldn't, that this was a violation of a trust that didn't even exist. But she couldn't stop herself. She untied the ribbon. The letters were written in a beautiful, flowing hand, the script of a woman who had once known a different life. They were love letters, but they weren't for Samuel. The salutation on each was the same. "My dearest Silas." Clara sat on the floor. The letters spread around her, and read about a life that had been violently extinguished. Hannah wrote to her dead husband of their shared dreams, of the color of the sky on the day they met, of the feel of his hand in hers. The voice in these letters was vibrant, full of passion, laughter, and a deep, abiding love. It was the voice of a woman Clara had never met, a woman who had died long before Silas had. Tucked at the very bottom of the bundle was one last letter, folded but not sealed, on a different kind of paper. It wasn't addressed to Silas. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a confession, a spilling of a soul onto a page. Written, Clara guessed, in the early days after Samuel had brought her here. The silence in this house is a kind of peace. It began. He is a good man, this Samuel. He asks for nothing. He gave me a roof when the world would have given me stones, and a name when they had taken mine away. For this, I am grateful. I will serve him for the rest of my days. But there is a truth in my heart that I must write, if only for myself to see. I have never loved Samuel. My love is buried in the cold ground with you, my Silas. I have never loved him, but he saved me when no one else would look at me. It is a debt that can never be paid. Clara folded the letter, her hands shaking. The words confirmed everything. Debt, gratitude, service, not love. This entire household was built not on affection, but on a transaction. And where did she fit in? Was Samuel's attention to her, the desperation she felt from him, truly for her? Or was it just an extension of his charity? Another attempt to bring life to a house where he had harbored only ghosts? Was she just another stray he had taken in out of pity? The thought was a poison that spread through her veins. It changed the way she saw everything. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, she saw Samuel walking not toward the house, but toward the lone cottonwood tree at the edge of the property. He carried a small stool with him. Clara watched from the kitchen window. Beneath the tree was a small, humble mound of stones, no bigger than a pillow, with a simple, weathered wooden cross stuck in the earth at its head. It was a grave. Samuel placed the stool beside the mound and simply sat, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He didn't speak, he didn't pray, he just sat, a silent vigil in the fading light. A cold dread washed over Clara as she realized what she was seeing. It was Hannah's grave. He had built a grave for his wife, and he visited it every evening, even though the woman herself was just 100 yards away, setting the table for dinner. He was mourning a part of her that had died. Her spirit, her love, the woman who had written those letters to Silas? Or perhaps he was mourning the very idea of a wife, a dream that had turned into a living, breathing responsibility. He was a man married to a ghost, and he had brought Clara here to try and exorcise it. That night, the silence at the dinner table was unbearable. Clara couldn't eat. She watched Samuel, his face carved in shadow, his movements slow and deliberate. The image of him by that false grave was burned into her mind. The question rose in her throat, a bitter, desperate thing, and she couldn't swallow it back down. "Do you love anyone else besides me?" she blurted out, the words loud and stark in the quiet room. Hannah, who was clearing the plates, froze for a fraction of a second. Samuel slowly lifted his head, his pale blue eyes meeting Clara's across the table. His face was a mask of stone. She waited, her entire being focused on his answer. A simple no would have been enough. A lie, even a clumsy one, would have been a balm. He gave her nothing. He held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw not deception, but a sorrow so profound it was bottomless. Then he looked away, pushing his chair back from the table. He stood up and walked out of the house, into the darkness. His silence was her answer. It was a confession more damning than any words. Something inside Clara snapped. A wild, frantic energy surged through her. She ran. She fled the house. The suffocating silence. The table set for 3 ghosts. She ran past the barn, past the corral, her feet finding the familiar path that led down to the shallow, slow-moving river where the women did the washing. She found Hannah there, standing at the water's edge. Though it was long past dark, it was as if she had been waiting. The moonlight silvered the surface of the water and cast Hannah in a spectral glow. Clara stopped, breathing in ragged gasps, her chest heaving. "Why?" she cried, her voice raw. "Why are you still here? Why do you stay?" Hannah turned slowly. Her face was calm, her expression one of deep, deep weariness. "This is my home," she said simply. "This isn't a home!" Clara shrieked, the words tearing from her. "It's a tomb! Don't you see it? He mourns you every night at a pile of rocks. Did you ever want this? Did you ever want to be a real wife to him?" Hannah looked at Clara, and for the first time a small, sad smile touched her lips. It was a smile of infinite pity, not for herself, but for Clara's innocence. It was the smile of a woman who knew truths the girl couldn't yet comprehend. "Want to?" she said, her voice soft as the rustle of dry leaves. "Of course, child. Every woman wants that." She paused, her gaze drifting over the dark, flowing water. "But he never once called me wife." The quiet accord Clara and Hannah had reached by the riverbed was a fragile, unacknowledged thing, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning mist. It was a shared understanding born not of words, but of a common sorrow. The house, however, remained a place of heavy silences, governed by the orbit of the man who was a husband to both and to neither. The revelation that Samuel had never called Hannah wife had not solved anything for Clara. It had simply deepened the mystery and the ache. It was a truth that explained everything and nothing at all. This fragile truce, this quiet accommodation of 3 lonely souls, was shattered by the arrival of a horseman. He was not a neighbor or a traveler seeking water, but the deputy from Redemption, a thin, sallow man named Miller, whose official-looking badge was the only impressive thing about him. He rode into the yard in a cloud of dust, dismounted with a weary sigh, and handed Samuel a folded, official-looking document. Clara watched from the kitchen window, a dish rag clutched in her hand. Hannah stood on the porch, motionless, wiping her hands on her apron, her face betraying nothing. Samuel read the document, his expression hardening from its usual stoicism into something grim and dangerous. He didn't say a word to the deputy. He simply nodded, a single, sharp jerk of his head. And the man, looking relieved to be finished with his business, mounted his horse and retreated back toward the world of men and laws. Samuel came inside, the paper held loosely in his hand. "They've convened a hearing," he said, his voice flat, directed at the room itself rather than at either woman. Silas's cousin from back east, a man named Jebediah. He's filed a formal complaint, reopening the inquiry into Silas's death. The air went out of the room. For Clara, the words were a confirmation of the whispers she'd heard in the general store. For Hannah, it was the sound of a grave, long since covered over, being clawed open again. She didn't flinch. Her hands, which had been wiping her apron, simply came to a rest at her sides. She looked like a woman who had been expecting this very piece of paper for years. "When?" she asked, her voice a dry rustle. "Friday," Samuel said. "You're summoned to appear." The day of the hearing. The world seemed to hold its breath. The sky was a hard, cloudless blue, and the sun beat down with a pitiless intensity. Samuel readied the wagon, his movements jerky and efficient. Hannah emerged from the house wearing the same gray, threadbare dress she wore most days, but with a small, dark shawl clutched around her shoulders as if she were cold. Her face was pale, her eyes like two dark holes in a sheet. "I'm going with you," Clara said, her voice firmer than she felt. Samuel looked at her, his brows furrowed. "There's no need. It's town business." "She shouldn't be alone," Clara insisted, looking not at Samuel, but at Hannah. It was the first time she had ever presumed to make a decision for the household. The first time she had acted not as a guest or an intruder, but as something else, an ally. Hannah looked at Clara, a flicker of surprise in her weary eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The matter was settled. The journey into redemption was a silent torment. Clara sat beside Hannah on the wagon seat, the space between them charged with unspoken dread. As they drew closer to the town, Clara could feel a palpable shift in the world. The open, indifferent cruelty of the land was being replaced by something more focused and personal, the cruelty of people. She was beginning to understand that the wind and the dust were honest in their brutality. They did not pretend to be righteous. The town, however, would cloak its venom in piety and justice. The hearing was not held in a proper courthouse, for redemption had none. It was to take place in the town's largest building. The saloon, the bar was closed, the whiskey bottles covered with a sheet, but the smell of stale beer and sawdust still hung heavy in the air. The room was packed. It seemed the entire population had turned out for the spectacle. They sat on benches and chairs dragged in for the occasion, their faces a sea of grim, hungry curiosity. This was theater for them, a welcome diversion from the monotony of their hard lives. As Hannah and Clara entered, a wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Every eye was on Hannah. Clara could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the sheer force of their judgment. They were not looking at a woman. They were looking at a story they had told themselves for years. The town's own dark legend, the Black Widow of redemption. Clara felt a surge of protective anger so fierce it surprised her. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them to look away, but she was trapped in her own terrified silence. They were given a bench at the front, the justice of the peace. A man named Henderson with a drooping mustache and self-important air presided from behind a makeshift table. A man Clara had never seen before, a fleshy, red-faced man in a cheap suit, stood up. This, she presumed, was Jebediah, the cousin. His eyes were small and greedy. The hearing began. It was not a trial of facts, but an airing of grievances. Jebediah spoke first, his voice oily with false grief. He spoke of his beloved cousin Silas, a man in the prime of his life. Struck down with no warning, he painted a picture of Hannah as a cold, aloof woman, not a proper wife, a woman who kept to herself and had a strange way with herbs. Then, Henderson called upon others to speak. The woman from the general store, the one with the face like a dried apple, stood up. Her name was Martha. She spoke of how Hannah never cried at the funeral, how her eyes were dry as a bone. She recounted, with relish, how Hannah had been seen gathering plants down by the riverbed just days before Silas's death. Unnatural plants, she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Another man, a farmer whose land bordered Silas's old property, spoke of how quiet the farm had become in the months before the death, how he never heard a cross word, but never a kind one either. He said it was a house without joy. Clara listened, her stomach churning. This was not evidence. It was poison. It was the careful, malicious construction of a cage of suspicion, built bar by bar from whispers, innuendo, and the deep-seated fear of anything different. They were condemning Hannah not for what she had done, but for who she was, a quiet woman who did not perform her grief to their satisfaction. Clara looked at Hannah. She sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. She was a statue of endurance, a rock against which the waves of their hatred crashed and broke. Where was Samuel? The hearing had been going on for nearly an hour, and his seat beside them remained empty. A cold knot of fear formed in Clara's belly. Had he abandoned them? Had he decided this fight was not his? The justice of the peace finally turned his watery eyes to Hannah. Mrs. He paused, as if the name were distasteful. Do you have anything to say in response to these observations? The entire room held its breath. Hannah slowly turned her head and looked at the justice. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. What could she say? How could she defend herself against the crime of being disliked? How could she prove the negative? That she had not put something in her husband's food, that she had loved him, that her grief was a private, silent thing, not a public performance? She simply shook her head, a single, tired gesture of defeat. A murmur of satisfaction went through the crowd. Her silence was their proof. It was then that the doors at the back of the saloon swung open with a loud creak. Samuel stood there. He was not dressed for a hearing. He was in his work clothes, dust on his boots, a streak of grime on his cheek. He had clearly ridden hard. He didn't look at the crowd. His pale blue eyes scanned the room and found Hannah and Clara. He walked forward, his stride long and deliberate. The crowd parted for him, their whispers dying in their throats. There was an authority about him, a dangerous stillness that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He didn't stop until he was standing beside the bench, a tall, solid presence next to the two women. He looked at the justice of the peace, his gaze level and cold. "This is a waste of time," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Justice Henderson puffed out his chest. "This is a legal proceeding. Samuel, there are serious accusations." "There is gossip," Samuel cut him off. "There is greed." He glanced at Jebediah, a look of such profound contempt that the man actually took a step back. Samuel then turned his gaze back to Henderson, but his next words were for the entire room. He placed a large, calloused hand on Hannah's shoulder. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the public contact. "She is my wife," Samuel stated, each word as solid and heavy as a stone. It was not a plea. It was not a defense. It was a fact, an unshakable truth he was planting in the center of their tawdry spectacle. Whatever happened in the past, whatever you think you know, is done. She has been my wife for 5 years. Her life is with me now. I am responsible for her. A stunned silence fell over the room. He had not proclaimed her innocence. He had not offered an alibi or a defense. He had simply absorbed her into himself, shielding her with his name, his reputation, and his quiet, formidable strength. He had drawn a line in the dust, and dared any of them to cross it. The justice of the peace cleared his throat, flustered. The town's righteous anger had just run headlong into the reality of Samuel's standing. He was a loner, but he was a landowner, a man who owed nothing to anyone. He was not a man to be trifled with. "Well," Henderson stammered, shuffling his papers. "Given the lack of any new tangible evidence, and in light of Mr. Samuel's testimony as to her character, this hearing is concluded. The original finding stands. Case dismissed." It was not an exoneration. It was a grudging retreat. Hannah was free. But the verdict in the eyes of the town was unchanged. As Samuel led them out of the saloon, the stares that followed them were no longer just curious. They were filled with a resentful, thwarted malice. The ride back to the ranch was the most silent of all. The air in the wagon was thick with the residue of the day's trauma. When they finally arrived, Samuel unhitched the horses without a word and led them to the barn. Hannah walked toward the house, her shoulders slumped, her body moving as if every bone ached. She looked 10 years older than she had that morning. Clara watched her go, and something inside her finally broke. All the confusion, the jealousy, the fear she had felt toward this woman dissolved, washed away by a flood of profound empathy and shame. She ran after her, catching up to her on the porch. "Hannah," she said, her voice choked with tears. Hannah stopped but did not turn. Clara fell to her knees on the rough wooden planks of the porch. She didn't know what else to do. It was an act of supplication, of apology. She reached out and took the hem of Hannah's worn dress in her hand. "I'm sorry," Clara sobbed, the words torn from her. "I'm so sorry for everything, for what they did, for what I thought." She looked up, her vision blurred with tears. At the older woman's rigid back, for the first time, she used the word that her heart had been whispering. "Sister." At that word, Hannah's body shuddered. A single, dry sob escaped her. She turned, slowly, and looked down at the weeping girl at her feet. Her face was a mask of sorrow. But for the first time, Clara saw something else in her eyes, not a rival, not a ghost, but a fellow survivor. Hannah reached down and placed a trembling hand on Clara's head. It was a benediction, a beginning. From that day on, the fragile truce became a fragile peace. An unspoken acceptance settled over the three of them. Samuel, in his quiet way, began to care for them both. He would sometimes bring back a wildflower for the table, placing it in a jar of water without comment, a gift for the house, for both of them. He began to divide his time, his presence. Some nights he would remain by the fire until late, a silent companion to Hannah's mending. On other nights, he would climb the stairs to Clara's attic room. There was no pretense of romance, but there was a deep, abiding comfort in his solid presence, a warmth that pushed back the loneliness. Clara and Hannah forged their own language, a vocabulary of shared tasks and knowing glances. They worked together in the garden, their hands in the same soil. They kneaded bread at the same table. Clara's respect for Hannah grew into a quiet, fierce affection. She saw the strength it took for her to rise each morning and face a world that had tried to destroy her. And in this strange, quiet peace, life began to stir. Clara realized, with a jolt of terror and wonder, that her monthly courses had ceased. She was pregnant. The knowledge was a secret she kept for weeks, a warm, terrifying coal in the pit of her stomach. Finally, one evening, she told Samuel. They were in her small room, the moonlight painting a silver square on the floor. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, pulling on his boots. "I'm with child," she whispered into the darkness. He stopped, his hands frozen on his bootlaces. He slowly looked up at her. In the dim light, she couldn't read his expression, but she felt the stillness in him, the weight of his reaction. He stood up, walked to her, and placed a hand on her still flat stomach. His touch was reverent. "A child," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He looked past her, out the small window at the dark, sprawling land. "This is it, then," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "A chance to start over, to do it right, this time." The words were meant to be a comfort, a promise, but to Clara, they were a death sentence, a chance to start over. He wasn't starting over with her. He was starting over from Hannah. He was trying to erase the failure of his first, barren, silent marriage. She was not the partner in this new beginning. She was merely the vessel. The baby was not a symbol of their union. It was a replacement for the child Hannah had never given him. Her own identity, her own small, flickering sense of self-worth, was extinguished in that moment. She was a tool, a means to an end, a fertile womb purchased to correct a past mistake. The old shame, the feeling of being a soiled and used thing from her life in New York, a past she had never spoken of, came rushing back with the force of a flash flood. She had run 1,000 miles to escape that feeling, only to find it waiting for her here, in the heart of her husband's clumsy hope. That night, she didn't sleep. She waited until the house was deep in the silence of the early morning hours. She waited until Samuel's breathing in the room below had deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Then, she slipped out of her cot. She packed a small bundle, a piece of bread, a canteen of water, the few dollars she had kept hidden. She put on her sturdiest shoes. With one last look at the quiet, sleeping house that had been her prison and her sanctuary, she crept down the stairs and out into the cold, pre-dawn darkness. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to run. She walked out into the vast, empty plains, a lone figure under a blanket of indifferent stars, carrying a life she no longer wanted, a life that had become the ultimate symbol of her own erasure. The discovery of Clara's absence came not with a cry, but with a deepening of the morning silence. It was Hannah who noticed it first. The attic room door was ajar, the cot neatly, unnaturally made, and the air held a cold stillness that spoke of long vacancy. Then she saw the small bundle of her own belongings, left on the cot, a spare shawl, a small book of psalms, a silent, sorrowful offering, an apology Clara couldn't speak aloud. When Samuel learned of it, a terrible, violent stillness descended upon him. He didn't rage or shout. He went to the barn, and for a full minute, he stood with his fists clenched, his back rigid, his entire body shaking with a silent, impotent fury directed entirely at himself. He had taken a broken thing and, in his clumsy attempt to fix his own life, had shattered it completely. For 2 days, he searched like a man possessed. He rode in ever-widening circles from the ranch, his face a grim mask of dust and despair. He pushed his horse to its limit, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for a sign, a footprint, a scrap of cloth. But the prairie was vast and indifferent. It swallowed secrets and left no trace. He returned each night, exhausted and defeated. The silence in the house now a screaming accusation. On the morning of the 3rd day, Hannah met him at the barn door as he prepared to ride out again. She was holding a small canvas satchel. In it was a full canteen of water, a hunk of dried beef, and a strip of clean linen. "You're looking in the wrong places," she said, her voice flat and certain. "You're looking for a woman who is lost. You should be looking for a woman who is hiding." Samuel looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue. "And where would she hide in all of this?" he asked, gesturing to the endless, empty land. "She's from the city," Hannah replied, her logic simple and devastating. "She doesn't know the land. She'll follow water if she can, and she'll look for shelter. Not a cave, a building, something a person made." She looked east, toward a string of low, rolling hills that marked the edge of a vast, waterless basin. "There's an old line shack out past the dry fork, shepherd's shelter, from before the drought. It's the only thing for 50 miles in that direction. That's 2 days' ride, in bad country." "Then I'd best be on my way," she said, and before he could protest, she had taken the reins of the buckskin mare, Daisy, and was leading her from the corral. "Hannah, you can't," he started, stepping toward her. She turned, and for the first time in years, he saw a fire in her eyes, a flicker of the woman she had been before the town of redemption had tried to burn her soul to ash. "You looked for her with your strength, Samuel," she said, her voice cutting through his exhaustion. "Now let me look for her with mine." He watched her go. He watched her mount the horse with a grim efficiency and ride east, a small, solitary figure shrinking against the vastness of the prairie. And he understood. She wasn't just going to find Clara. She was going to reclaim a piece of herself, the part that had been told she was a victim, a burden, a ghost. In that moment, she was more his wife than she had ever been, and she was leaving him to do it. The land Hannah rode into was a testament to God's indifference. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down, leaching the color from the sky and the life from the earth. The ground was a cracked gray skillet, and the heat rising from it distorted the air, making the horizon tremble. Hannah rode slowly, conserving the mare's energy, her eyes constantly scanning, not for a person, but for the subtle language of the land. By the second day, her water was half gone, her lips were cracked, and a dull headache had settled behind her eyes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the plodding of Daisy's hooves and the whisper of a wind that offered no relief. It was a silence that could drive a person mad, but Hannah had lived in silence for years. It was her native country. The storm came on the afternoon of the third day, a sudden, terrifying spectacle. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the horizon vanished behind a solid wall of roiling brown dust. The wind hit like a physical blow, a deafening roar that stole the breath from her lungs. Hannah dismounted, pulling the mare down into a shallow ravine, covering both their heads with a saddle blanket. For an hour, the world ceased to exist. It was a churning, stinging chaos of sand and wind. When it finally passed, the landscape was changed, alien. The sun was a pale, hazy disk in a sky thick with dust. She had lost her bearings, and she had lost precious time. She pushed on, her thirst now a constant, burning presence. That evening, as dusk was bleeding across the sky, she was gathering what little brush she could find for a small fire when she made a careless step. She was tired, her senses dulled by heat and dehydration. She didn't see the snake, coiled in the shade of a rock, until it struck. The pain was a sharp, electric shock in her calf. She cried out, stumbling back. Looking down, she saw the two small, distinct puncture marks already beginning to swell and darken. A cold, clear terror, sharper than any she had felt in the saloon, washed over her. She knew the bite was from a rattler. Out here, alone. It was a death sentence. But the woman who had survived the town of redemption was not one to die easily. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. With a steady hand, she pulled the small knife from her satchel. She sat on the ground, took a deep breath, and made two quick, shallow cuts over the bite, connecting the fang marks. Then, she lowered her head and, pressing her lips to her own flesh, began to suck at the wound, spitting the mixture of blood and venom onto the dusty ground. She did this again and again, until she was dizzy and weak. She used the linen strip to tie a tight band above the wound, then slumped back against the rock, her body slick with a cold sweat. The night was a fever dream. Waves of nausea and chills washed over her. Her leg throbbed with a fiery, relentless pain. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with disjointed images, Silas's face, pale in death, the hateful eyes of the women in the general store, Samuel sitting by the false grave. But through the delirium, one thought remained, a single, burning ember in the ashes of her mind. The girl. She had to find the girl. She clung to that thought as a drowning woman clings to a piece of driftwood. It was the only thing that kept her from letting go, from sinking into the welcoming darkness. She awoke to a gray dawn, her body aching, her legs swollen and stiff, but the fever had broken. She was alive. She drank the last few sips from her canteen, the warm, brackish water a sacrament on her parched tongue. Getting to her feet was an agony. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her leg, but she pulled herself into the saddle. She had to keep going. It was mid-afternoon when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a mirage, a trick of the heat, a small, dark shape on the horizon, a perfect, man-made square in a world of chaotic, natural forms, the line shack. As she drew closer, A wave of dread washed over her. The shack was little more than a pile of weathered, gray planks, its roof sagging, its single doorway a black, empty mouth. It looked abandoned, forgotten, a tombstone on the empty plains. But there were fresh tracks near the entrance, a woman's shoes. She slid from the saddle, her bad leg nearly buckling beneath her. She limped to the doorway and peered into the darkness within. The air inside was hot and still, thick with the smell of dust and despair. And then she saw her. Clara was lying on the dirt floor in the far corner, curled into a ball. Her face was pale and gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her dress was torn, and her dark hair was matted with sweat and dust. The slight swell of her pregnant belly was starkly visible, a small, vulnerable mound of life in a room that felt like death. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. For a moment, Hannah thought she was too late. A surge of adrenaline, born of a fierce, protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed, cut through her own pain and exhaustion. She knelt beside Clara, her rough fingers going to the girl's neck. A pulse, faint, thready, but there. Hannah went back outside, retrieved her nearly empty canteen and the satchel. She tore the last clean strip of linen, soaked it with the final drops of water, and began to gently bathe Clara's face, her cracked lips. "Clara," she whispered, her voice a hoarse croak. "Child, you must drink." She coaxed a few drops of water between Clara's lips, watching with desperate intensity as the girl's throat moved in a weak, reflexive swallow. For 2 days, Hannah nursed her. She found a small, stagnant pool of rainwater in a nearby rock formation, boiled it over a tiny fire to purify it, and patiently, drop by drop, forced the life-saving liquid into Clara. She foraged for what little she could find, tough roots and bitter greens, and made a thin, weak broth. She bathed Clara's feverish skin, held her hand through the long, dark hours of the night, and never once left her side. Her own snakebite throbbed, her own hunger gnawed at her, but none of it mattered. On the 3rd day, Clara's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with fever at first, unfocused. Then they cleared, and she saw the face hovering above her. Hannah, fear, shame, and a profound, bewildered gratitude warred in her expression. "You came," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I came," Hannah confirmed. That night, the fever broke. Clara was weak, but lucid. The small shack was dark, the only light coming from a sliver of moon in the doorway. They lay side by side on the hard dirt floor for warmth, 2 women adrift in a vast sea of darkness. And in that darkness, they began to speak. The words came slowly at first. Hesitant confessions whispered into the stillness. Hannah spoke of Silas, of the vibrant, laughing man she had loved, and of the crushing silence that had followed his death. She spoke of the town's hatred, of the way it had scoured her soul until she believed she was the monster they saw. Hearing Hannah's story, a dam inside Clara finally broke. She told Hannah everything, the story she had never told anyone. Not even Samuel. She spoke of New York, of being a seamstress in the house of a wealthy man. She spoke of his son, a handsome, charming man who had whispered promises of love and marriage. He had made her feel seen, special. And she, a poor girl with no prospects, had believed him. She had given him what he wanted in a moment of weakness and hope, and he had discarded her the next day, calling her a whore, his laughter echoing in her ears as she was thrown out into the street. The shame had been absolute. It had clung to her like a shroud. She had fled west not for a simpler life, but to outrun a disgrace that had defined her. "When Samuel said the baby was a chance to do it right," Clara whispered, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "All I could hear was that man's voice. I felt used, like I wasn't a person, just a vessel, a way for him to fix a mistake. I couldn't bear it." Hannah listened, her heart aching with a shared understanding. The details were different, but the story was the same. It was the story of being a woman in a world that saw you as property, as a vessel, as a reflection of a man's honor or a vessel for his shame. "He is not that man, Clara," Hannah said softly, her voice firm. "He is a clumsy man, a silent man. He is a fool who builds a grave for a woman who is still breathing. But he is a good man. He doesn't know the words." They lay in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared confession settling between them. They were no longer the first wife and the second wife. They were just Hannah and Clara, two women who had been broken by the world and were now, in this desolate, forgotten place, beginning to heal each other. Clara turned onto her side, her body aching, and reached out, her fingers finding Hannah's in the dark. She gripped her hand tightly. "I used to be so jealous of you," Clara said, her voice thick with tears. "I hated you for being here first, for having a history with him that I could never understand." She took a shaky breath. "But now, if I have to share a man, I only want it to be with you, sister." Hannah's fingers tightened around hers, in the darkness of the ruined shack, under the vast, uncaring sky. The two women held on to each other, a tiny, defiant island of solidarity in a world that had tried to tear them apart. The journey back was slow and arduous. They shared the horse, one riding while the other, leaning on a makeshift crutch, limped alongside. They were a strange, tattered pair, a portrait of mutual survival. As the familiar shape of the ranch house appeared on the horizon, a knot of apprehension tightened in Clara's stomach. Samuel was there. He had been watching, waiting, every day. When he saw the two figures approaching, he ran from the house, his long legs eating up the ground. He stopped a few yards away, his face a wreck of relief, guilt, and disbelief. He saw Hannah's swollen leg, Clara's gauntness, the way they supported each other. He saw, in a single, devastating glance, the journey they had taken and the bond they had forged in his absence. They stopped in front of him, standing together, a united front. There were no accusations, no angry words. Their shared presence was statement enough. And Samuel, the silent, stoic man who never showed a crack in his armor, did something that shattered all their expectations. He fell to his knees in the dust before them. He reached out, his hands trembling, and he took one of Hannah's hands and one of Clara's. He lowered his head and pressed his lips first to Hannah's rough, calloused knuckles, and then to Clara's. It was an act of complete and utter surrender. He looked up, his pale eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw, broken. "I was wrong. I failed you both." It was the first time either of them had ever heard him admit fault. It was the first time he had truly seen them, not as a duty and a desire, but as two whole, individual people whom he had wronged. That evening, the three of them sat at the dinner table. The silence was still there, but it was different. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating blanket of unspoken resentment. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, the quiet of a wound that has finally been cleaned and set to heal. They were a strange, impossible family, forged in hardship and misunderstanding, but they were a family nonetheless. They would wait for the child together, and they would, all three of them, finally begin to build a home. The winter that followed was a trial of ice and wind, a long, harsh season that seemed determined to break the spirit of the land one last time. It trapped the three of them in the small house, forcing a proximity that was at first awkward, and then, slowly, a comfort. The shared work of survival, chopping wood, melting snow for water, mending clothes by the firelight, wove their lives together with threads of common purpose. They learned the rhythms of one another's silence, the language of a shared glance or a helping hand offered without a word. But as the days began to lengthen and the iron grip of the frost began to loosen, something miraculous happened. The land, which had seemed dead and barren, began to breathe again. The first sign was the sound of melting, a gentle dripping from the eaves of the house, a soft gurgle from the long-frozen creek bed. Then came the smell, a rich, loamy scent of damp earth waking from its slumber. Spring did not arrive gently. It burst forth with a fierce, desperate beauty. The endless brown of the prairie was suddenly, astonishingly, brushed with a pale, tender green. The hillsides, which had been monuments to desolation, became tapestries of color as wildflowers, purple lupine, fiery Indian paintbrush, and the sunny yellow of prairie buttercups erupted from the soil. The lone cottonwood tree by the false grave sprouted 1,000 tiny, shimmering leaves, its branches reaching for a sky that was no longer a hard, pale gray, but a deep, vibrant blue. The world was being reborn, and inside the small house, a new world was waiting to be born as well. Clara's time came with the dawn of a warm May morning. It began as a low, persistent ache in her back, a tightening in her belly that was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she had grown used to. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the day had come. It was Hannah she went to first. She found her in the kitchen, kneading bread, her hands dusted with flour. Clara didn't have to speak. She simply stood in the doorway, her hand on her belly, her eyes wide. Hannah looked at her, and a deep, calm understanding passed between them. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements methodical and unhurried. "It is time," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Go and lie down. I will fetch Samuel and boil the water." There was no thought of riding for a doctor, no question of who would preside over this birth. In the quiet intimacy of their shared life, it was understood that this was their task, and theirs alone. They brought her not to the cold attic, but to Samuel's room, the room that had been the site of so much pain and confusion, the nexus of their tangled lives. They were reclaiming it, transforming it from a place of shadows into a sanctuary. Hannah stripped the bed and remade it with the cleanest linen sheets. Samuel, his face pale with a nervous anxiety that made his movements clumsy, filled every basin and bucket with water and set them on the stove to heat. He was a mountain of a man, capable of felling trees and breaking wild horses. But in the face of this miracle, he was humbled, his strength useful only in service to the two women who now commanded the house. The day wore on, a long crucible of pain and effort. Hannah was a rock. She was no longer the silent, haunted woman Clara had first met. She was a figure of immense, quiet strength, her voice a low, steady murmur of encouragement. She bathed Clara's forehead with cool cloths, her hands gentle and sure. She massaged the cramping muscles in her back. She spoke to her of breathing, of focusing on the rhythm of the pain, of working with it, not against it. She was a midwife not by training, but by a deep, instinctual wisdom, a knowledge of the cycles of life and death that the hard land had taught her. Samuel was their anchor. He stayed by the bedside, his large hand enveloping Clara's, a solid point of contact in a world that had dissolved into waves of pain. Clara would squeeze his hand until she thought his bones would break, and he never once flinched. His presence a constant, silent promise. "I am here. You are not alone." He would murmur her name, his voice rough with emotion. And in those moments, as she looked from his worried face to Hannah's calm one, Clara felt a surge of love for these two strange, broken people so profound it eclipsed the pain. The final moments came as the first, pale light of the new day was filtering through the window. The room was filled with a soft, ethereal glow. Clara, exhausted and near the end of her strength, felt a final, desperate urge to give up. "I can't," she sobbed, her head falling back against the sweat-soaked pillows. "Yes, you can, sister," Hannah said, her voice firm, her hands ready. "He is almost here. I can see his head. One more time. Clara, for him, for us." Clara looked at Samuel. His face was wet with tears, his expression one of complete, unguarded awe. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I love you, Clara," he whispered. The words she had once longed for, now spoken at the precipice of a new life. Gathering every last ounce of strength she possessed, Clara bore down with a final, guttural cry that seemed to tear from her very soul. And then, a release, a sudden, shocking emptiness. It was followed by a new sound. A sound the house had never heard before. A thin, wavering, but gloriously angry cry. The cry of a newborn, filling the room, filling their lives, filling the vast silent prairie with the defiant sound of life. Hannah, her face shining with tears, lifted the small, slippery body. "You have a son," she announced, her voice thick with wonder. She quickly cleaned him, wrapped him in a soft linen cloth, and placed the squirming, crying bundle in Clara's waiting arms. Clara looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face of her son, at his shock of dark hair, his perfect miniature fists flailing at the newness of the world. He was real. He was here. He was hers. A wave of love, so fierce and primal it was an ache in her chest, washed over her, cleansing her of all the old shame, all the old pain. She looked up, her vision swimming. Samuel was leaning over the bed, his large, calloused finger gently touching the baby's cheek, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated joy. Hannah was beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and in that moment, in the soft, forgiving light of the dawn, the three of them leaned in together, their heads bowed over the new life they had created. A strange and perfect trinity. They were no longer three separate, lonely people. They were a family. They wept and they laughed, their arms finding each other, holding on tight as their son's cries filled the room that had once been their darkness, and was now, finally, full of light. The news of the baby's birth, like all news, eventually found its way to redemption. At first, it was just more fuel for the fire of gossip. They speculated on the child's parentage, on the scandalous nature of the household, on the damnation that was sure to befall them all. The women would whisper behind their hands when Samuel came to the general store for supplies, his face softened by a new, quiet contentment they couldn't understand. But as the seasons turned, a strange thing happened. The gossip began to fade. The malice, which requires constant fuel, began to starve in the face of the family's placid happiness. The townsfolk would see them, on rare occasions. They would see Samuel, riding with the small boy held securely in front of him on the saddle. They would see the two women, sitting together on the wagon seat, their heads sometimes close in quiet conversation, a shared smile passing between them. There was no misery to feed on. There was no drama, no shame. There was only a quiet, unshakable peace that emanated from the ranch, a contentment so profound it was its own kind of shield. The people of redemption, faced with a story that refused to conform to their dark expectations, eventually fell silent. They didn't understand it, and so they chose to ignore it. The strange family on the Samuel ranch was left alone, in a world of their own making. One night, years later, the boy, whom they had named Silas Daniel, one name for the past, one for the future, was asleep in the house. The air was cool and clear, the sky a vast sweep of velvet spangled with 1,000,000 stars. The three of them sat around a small campfire in the yard, the crackling flames casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. They had grown into their life together, their roles shifting and blending like the colors in a sunset. They were not husband and wives in any conventional sense. They were partners. They were pillars of a single, unique structure, each essential to the whole. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the flames. It was Samuel who finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I think about it sometimes," he said, looking into the fire. "The beginning, all the mistakes I made." He looked up, First at Hannah, whose face was calm and serene in the firelight, and then at Clara, who watched him with a soft, knowing gaze. "If I had to choose again," he said, his words simple, stripped of all artifice, coming from the very core of him. "Knowing everything I know now, I would still want to marry you both." It was the truth, the final, absolute truth of his heart. It was not a choice between two loves, but an affirmation of one life, the one they had built together out of the wreckage of three. Clara smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. She reached out and took Hannah's hand, her fingers lacing through the older woman's. She looked at Hannah, a look of profound gratitude and shared history. Then she looked back at Samuel, her eyes shining in the firelight. "She once said, 'Let her watch,'" Clara said, her voice a soft, gentle whisper. The memory was no longer a wound, but a scar, a reminder of a battle fought and won. "Now," she said, squeezing Hannah's hand, "it's my turn to say, 'Let her stay.'" The story ends there, but it also begins there. It begins with the image of two women standing together on the porch of a small house in the vast, empty plains. The sun is setting, painting the sky in strokes of gold and crimson. They are hand in hand, their shoulders lightly touching, watching a tall, broad-shouldered man lead a horse toward the barn in the fading light. They are not rivals. They are not ghosts or replacements. They are Hannah and Clara. They are mothers. They are partners. They are home. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this. And please share your thoughts on the journey of Samuel, Hannah, and Clara.